Have you ever been called an embarrassment by someone who has absolutely no idea what you've accomplished? That's exactly what happened to me on what should have been one of the proudest days of my family's life. Picture this, a beautiful spring afternoon outside a university auditorium, graduates in their caps and gowns everywhere, parents snapping photos with their phones held high, people clutching flowers and balloons with tears of joy in their eyes. I was standing off to the side, quietly holding a bouquet I'd bought for my younger brother, genuinely happy for his achievement, wanting nothing more than to celebrate his hard work and dedication. Then my mother appeared beside me, and with that tight, controlled smile she always wore when she wanted to hurt me in public, she leaned close enough that the relatives standing nearby could hear every word. She said, "I embarrassed this family," told me to look at my brother and then look at myself, as if the comparison would somehow explain everything wrong with my existence. Then she straightened up, turned to the cluster of aunts and uncles watching us, and announced loud enough for everyone to hear that they were so proud of at least one of their children today. The implication was crystal clear. I was the disappointment, the black sheep, the child who didn't measure up. People exchanged those awkward glances that happen when someone says something cruel in public, and nobody knows whether to acknowledge it or pretend they didn't hear. Some looked away quickly, others gave me pitying looks like I was some tragic figure who deserved their sympathy. I just stood there, taking a slow breath, my hands gripping that bouquet so tight the stems were probably bruising my palms. But inside my head, one thought kept repeating on an endless loop. Embarrass this family? The only reason this ceremony is even happening, with the new funding, the expanded scholarships, the state-of-the-art lab wing they've been building, all of that exists because of the $2.1 million anonymous donation I wired to this school just yesterday. She had no idea. None of them did. And in just a few hours, when the deans stood on that stage and announced the generous endowment that would change the lives of future students, she was going to find out that the family embarrassment she'd just publicly shamed was actually the biggest benefactor her precious institution had seen in years. To understand why that moment felt like a knife to the chest, you need to understand the dynamic that's existed in my family for as long as I can remember. My mother has always operated on a very specific definition of success, one that involves traditional markers like degrees from prestigious universities, stable corporate jobs with impressive titles, and a life path that follows a predictable, respectable trajectory. My younger brother fit that mold perfectly. He was the golden child from the moment he started bringing home straight-A report cards in elementary school. He studied hard, never caused trouble, got into a good university on a partial scholarship, maintained a spot on the dean's list every semester, and was now graduating with honors in a field my mother could brag about at dinner parties. I, on the other hand, was the problem child, not because I was a bad person or got into trouble, but because I didn't follow the script she'd written for my life. I started college on a traditional path, but halfway through my sophomore year, I realized the corporate career trajectory everyone expected me to follow felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. I was suffocating in lecture halls, feeling like I was memorizing information for tests rather than actually learning anything useful. So I made a decision that my mother considered the ultimate betrayal. I dropped out. Not permanently, but I took what was supposed to be a semester off to explore other options, and that semester turned into a year, and that year turned into me never going back to finish my degree in the traditional sense. Instead, I dove headfirst into the world of online business, remote work, and digital entrepreneurship. I taught myself skills that weren't being offered in classrooms, things like digital marketing, content creation, software development basics, and how to build scalable online businesses. The early years were rough. I was barely making enough to cover rent, living in a tiny apartment, working 16-hour days on projects that sometimes failed spectacularly. Every family gathering became an interrogation, where my mother would ask, with that disappointed edge in her voice, when I was going to stop playing around and get a real job. She'd compare me to my brother constantly, holding up his accomplishments like a mirror to reflect my failures. When relatives asked about me, she'd give these devastating one-sentence summaries of my life. Didn't finish school on time, keeps changing careers, always chasing some new idea that never works out. Meanwhile, my brother got the glowing introductions, full scholarship recipient, dean's list every semester, making us so proud. The pattern was relentless and exhausting. But here's what she didn't see, what she refused to acknowledge even when the evidence was right in front of her. I was actually succeeding on a level she couldn't comprehend because it didn't fit her narrow definition of achievement. Those online businesses I was building, they started generating serious revenue. The skills I taught myself became incredibly valuable in a rapidly digitizing economy. Within 5 years of leaving college, I was earning more than most people with traditional degrees and corporate jobs. Within 7 years, my net worth had climbed into the millions. I had multiple revenue streams, investments that were compounding, and the kind of financial freedom that most people spend their entire careers chasing. But because I didn't have a framed diploma on my wall or a business card with an impressive title, because I worked from home in comfortable clothes rather than commuting to an office in a suit, my mother saw me as a failure. She consciously ignored every success I achieved because those successes couldn't be easily explained to her social circle. How do you brag at a dinner party that your child runs a successful online platform when you don't even understand what that means? How do you boast about digital revenue streams to friends who measure success in job titles and corner offices? So she simply pretended my accomplishments didn't exist and continued treating me like the family disappointment. The most painful part wasn't even the comparison to my brother. I genuinely loved my brother and wanted him to succeed. I was proud of his academic achievements. The painful part was that my mother couldn't hold space for two different kinds of success. In her mind, there was only one right path, and anyone who strayed from it was automatically a failure, regardless of the actual outcomes they achieved. I'd tried in the early years to share my wins with her. When I landed my first major client, when my business hit its first 6-figure year, when I made my first successful investment that doubled in value, I'd bring these things up in conversation, hoping for some acknowledgement or encouragement, but she'd always find a way to diminish them. She'd point out the risks, question the sustainability, or just change the subject to something my brother had accomplished. Eventually, I stopped trying. I stopped sharing my financial success, stopped talking about my work, stopped expecting her validation. It was easier to just let her believe whatever narrative she'd constructed about my life than to constantly fight for recognition that would never come. But that didn't stop her from using me as her cautionary tale, her example of what happens when you don't follow the rules. And it definitely didn't prepare either of us for what was about to happen at my brother's graduation. The morning of graduation day, I woke up genuinely excited. Whatever complicated feelings I had about my mother's treatment of me, I was truly happy for my brother. He'd worked incredibly hard for 4 years, juggling a heavy course load with part-time jobs to help cover expenses that his partial scholarship didn't handle. I'd watched him stress over exams, pull all-nighters on major projects, sacrifice social experiences to stay on track academically. He deserved this moment, and I wanted to be there to celebrate it with him. I bought a nice bouquet of flowers, dressed in what I thought was appropriately smart casual attire, and drove to the university campus where the ceremony would be held. The scene outside the auditorium before the ceremony was exactly what you'd expect: pure joy and celebration. Graduates were taking photos with their families, adjusting their caps, laughing with their friends. Parents were crying happy tears, grandparents were beaming with pride, younger siblings were bored but trying to look enthusiastic. I found my family in the crowd, gave my brother a hug and congratulated him, handed him the flowers I'd brought. For a moment, everything felt normal and good. Then one of my aunts, my mother's sister, came over to join our little cluster. She was making small talk, asking my brother about his plans after graduation, congratulating my parents on raising such a successful son. Then she turned to me with what I'm sure she thought was a friendly, conversational question. She asked if I'd ever thought about going back to school, finishing my degree, maybe following in my brother's footsteps. It was an innocent enough question, the kind of thing relatives ask when they're trying to make conversation but don't really know what's going on in your life. Before I could even formulate a response, before I could explain that I was actually doing quite well without a traditional degree, my mother jumped in with an answer that took my breath away. She said, with that tight smile still plastered on her face, that school isn't for everyone, that some kids just choose disappointing paths. The words hung in the air like a slap. Other relatives shifted uncomfortably. My brother looked mortified. But my mother wasn't done. She leaned in close to me, close enough that her words were technically private but loud enough that everyone nearby could still hear, and said something I will never forget. She told me I embarrassed this family, told me to try not to ruin my brother's day with my presence. The humiliation was designed to be public enough to sting, but quiet enough that she could deny it later if challenged. My throat went tight. My eyes burned with the threat of tears I absolutely refused to shed in that moment. Every instinct screamed at me to defend myself, to list my accomplishments, to throw my net worth in her face and watch her expression change. But I didn't. I just kept my face blank, neutral, gave a small nod like I'd acknowledged her comment, and stepped back slightly from the group. Inside my head, though, a different conversation was happening. I was thinking about the phone calls I'd had with the dean's office over the past few weeks, about the wire transfer confirmation I'd received just yesterday, about the announcement that was scheduled to happen during today's graduation. I was thinking that she had no idea, absolutely no clue, that some of the students in this graduating class, including potentially some of my brother's friends, were going to receive scholarship letters next year with funding that came directly from me. She didn't know the new lab wing they'd been constructing, the one that would bear a dedication plaque thanking an anonymous donor, existed because of my money. She saw me as an embarrassment, a stain on the family reputation, while having no concept of the fact that I'd just made one of the largest single donations in this institution's recent history. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe through it. But I decided in that moment to let it play out. I wasn't going to announce what I'd done. I wasn't going to defend myself or argue. I was simply going to wait and let the truth reveal itself in its own time. Let me explain how we got to the point where I was in a position to donate $2.1 million to my brother's university. As I mentioned, my online businesses and investments had been incredibly successful over the years, far exceeding what I'd ever imagined when I first started out. By the time my brother was in his junior year of college, I had accumulated enough wealth that I started seriously thinking about philanthropy and how I wanted to use my financial success to make a positive impact. I'd watched my brother struggle with the financial burden of university. His partial scholarship covered tuition, but he still had to work multiple part-time jobs to afford housing, books, food, and other expenses. I'd helped him out quietly here and there, sending money for textbooks or covering a rent payment when I knew he was stretched thin, but I always did it in ways that felt like brotherly support rather than charity. I didn't want him to feel indebted or uncomfortable. But as graduation approached, I started thinking bigger. I wanted to do something that would not only honor my brother's hard work, but also help future students who were in similar situations, struggling to afford an education despite their talent and dedication. So I reached out to the university's development office, the department that handles major gifts and donations. I explained that I was interested in establishing a significant endowment fund, specifically designated for scholarships in my brother's program and for supporting the department's facilities and resources. The conversations that followed were extensive. The development director was incredibly professional and helpful, walking me through options for how the gift could be structured, what kind of impact different funding amounts would have, and how donor recognition typically worked. I ultimately decided on $2.1 million. The number wasn't random. It was calculated based on what the university said they needed to fully fund a certain number of scholarships per year in perpetuity, plus contribute meaningfully to the new laboratory wing they were constructing. The money would come from a combination of liquid assets I had sitting in various accounts and some appreciated stock positions I was planning to sell anyway for tax purposes. From a financial standpoint, it was a significant gift, but not one that would dramatically impact my overall wealth or financial security. I could afford it, and more importantly, I wanted to do it. The question then became how to handle donor recognition. The development office explained that major donors typically receive public acknowledgement, things like named scholarship funds, plaques on buildings, mentions in the university magazine and at events. But I specifically requested that the gift remain anonymous, at least initially. I didn't want my mother to know what I'd done, because I knew she'd find a way to make it about herself, to take credit for my success, or to use it as ammunition in future arguments. I also didn't want my brother's graduation day to become about me and my donation rather than about his achievement. However, I did agree to one thing. The development office could announce during the graduation ceremony that a major gift had been received, thanking the anonymous donor and explaining how it would benefit students. This was standard practice for them, a way to show current students and their families that the institution was well supported and growing. They wouldn't use my name in the announcement unless I gave explicit permission. The original plan was to keep it completely anonymous even in that moment, but after my mother's comment outside the auditorium, after being called an embarrassment in front of extended family, something shifted in my thinking. I found the development director before the ceremony started, while families were still filing into the auditorium and finding their seats. I pulled her aside and asked if it would be possible to modify the announcement slightly. I said that if she was comfortable with it, and if it felt appropriate during the ceremony, she could mention that the donor was a family member of someone in the graduating class, and that if that person was willing, they could be acknowledged with a simple standing recognition. Nothing elaborate, no spotlight or speech, just a moment of acknowledgement. She looked at me carefully and asked if I was sure, if something had changed. I told her honestly that I'd been publicly humiliated by a family member who had no idea what I'd accomplished, and that while I didn't want to grandstand or take attention away from the graduates, I also no longer wanted to protect people who were actively undermining me. She understood immediately. She said she'd work it into the remarks naturally and respectfully. As I walked into the auditorium and found my seat next to my family, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't doing this for revenge in some petty sense. I wasn't trying to humiliate my mother the way she humiliated me, though I won't lie and say there wasn't some satisfaction in knowing she was about to be very surprised. What I was doing was setting a boundary, showing that my accomplishments were real and significant, regardless of whether they fit her narrow definition of success, and making it clear that I would no longer accept being treated as a family embarrassment when the reality was so drastically different. The graduation ceremony began. Graduates filed in to processional music, and I sat there waiting for the moment when everything would change. The graduation ceremony followed the traditional format. Welcome remarks from the dean, a keynote speech from some distinguished alumnus, recognition of honors graduates, and then the conferring of degrees. My brother's name was called. He walked across the stage, shook hands with the dean, received his diploma cover, and posed for the official photographer. I clapped and cheered along with my parents and the rest of our family section. My mother was beaming, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, the picture of a proud parent. She'd completely forgotten, or chosen to ignore, the cruel thing she'd said to me less than 2 hours earlier. After all the degrees were conferred and the graduates were seated again, the dean returned to the podium for closing remarks. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The dean began by congratulating all the graduates and their families, acknowledging the hard work and sacrifice that went into earning a degree. Then her tone shifted slightly, becoming more serious and heartfelt. She said she wanted to share some exciting news with the graduating class and their families, news that had just come together in recent days and would have a profound impact on future students. She explained that the university had received an extraordinarily generous gift from an anonymous donor, a contribution of $2.1 million designated specifically for scholarships and program enhancement in the very department most of these graduates had just completed. The auditorium erupted in applause. People were genuinely moved by this announcement. Students were looking at each other with excited expressions, probably thinking about friends and younger students who would benefit. Parents were nodding approvingly, clearly impressed by this show of generosity. My mother's expression was one of polite interest, probably assuming this was some wealthy alumnus or corporate foundation making a standard large donation. The dean continued, explaining that this gift would fund multiple full scholarships annually, support new equipment and facilities, and create opportunities for students who might otherwise struggle to afford their education. Then she paused, looked down at her notes, and said something that made my heart start racing. She said the donor had requested to remain largely anonymous, but had given permission for one small acknowledgement. She explained that the donor was actually a family member of one of today's graduates, someone who understood intimately the challenges and rewards of higher education, and who wanted to give back in a meaningful way. She asked if that person would be willing to stand briefly so the community could express gratitude. For a moment, I genuinely considered staying seated. The attention, the spotlight, it wasn't why I'd made the donation. But then I thought about my mother's words, about being called an embarrassment, about years of being treated as less than because my success didn't look the way she expected it to. I stood up. Slowly, calmly, I rose from my seat in the middle of our family row. The dean smiled and gestured toward me, leading another round of applause that was even louder than before. People in nearby rows turned to look, some recognizing me as the sibling they'd seen in family photos, others just impressed by the gesture. The applause seemed to go on forever. I gave a small nod of acknowledgement to the dean and the graduates, then sat back down, my heart pounding but my face composed. The moment I sat down, I felt the shift in energy next to me. My mother had gone completely still. I could see her in my peripheral vision, her face frozen in an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly. Confusion. Maybe the beginning of realization dawning. My brother, sitting on my other side before he'd processed up with the graduates, had been watching the ceremony from the family section. His eyes were wide, and he leaned over to whisper that he had no idea, that I'd never said anything. I whispered back that it was supposed to be a surprise, that I wanted his day to be about his achievement, not my donation. But even as I said those words, I knew the dynamic had fundamentally changed. My mother knew now. She knew that while she was telling relatives I was a disappointment, while she was instructing me not to embarrass the family, I had been quietly arranging to give more money to this institution than she would probably earn in her entire lifetime. She knew that the dean of this prestigious university had just publicly thanked me, that hundreds of people in this auditorium had just applauded my generosity, that the official record would forever show that someone from our family, specifically the child she considered a failure, had made a transformational gift to this place she so deeply respected. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. There was more applause, more congratulations, the traditional turning of tassels, and finally the recessional as graduates filed out. As we stood to leave, people I didn't know were reaching across rows to shake my hand, to thank me, to tell me what an incredible thing I'd done. My mother stood silently beside me, her face still frozen in that strange expression, not saying a word. The real confrontation didn't happen immediately. We took the obligatory family photos outside the auditorium, my mother still silent but going through the motions with mechanical precision. My brother kept looking between us, clearly sensing the tension but not wanting to address it on his big day. Extended family members who'd witnessed my mother's earlier comment were now approaching me with new awareness, suddenly friendly and congratulatory, their earlier pity replaced with respect. the shift was stark and honestly a little uncomfortable. After the photos, after my brother went off to celebrate with his friends, after the crowd dispersed and we walked to the parking lot, my mother finally spoke. She asked in a voice that was trying to sound calm, but had an edge of accusation, why I hadn't told her I was planning to make such a large donation. I stopped walking and turned to face her directly. I told her that I wanted today to be about my brother, about his hard work and achievement, not about me or my money. I'd specifically requested the donation remain anonymous because I didn't want to take any attention away from the graduates. She tried another angle. She said I'd made her look terrible, that people were now asking her questions about my finances and my success, and she didn't know how to answer because I never told her anything. The accusation implicit in her tone was clear. This was somehow my fault for not keeping her informed. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice level and calm, though inside I was shaking with years of accumulated hurt. I reminded her that just a few hours earlier, she had told me I embarrassed this family. She had said those exact words, in public, surrounded by relatives, deliberately designed to humiliate me on what should have been a joyful day. I asked her if she felt any shame about that moment, any regret for those words. She tried to deflect, saying she was just frustrated, that she worried about my future, that she wanted what was best for me. I cut her off. I told her that for years she'd measured my worth by markers that didn't apply to my life. She dismissed my success because it didn't come with a diploma framed on a wall or a job title she could brag about at dinner parties. She compared me unfavorably to my brother at every opportunity, using me as an example of what not to do, holding up his achievements while ignoring mine. And today, when she finally saw undeniable proof that I had succeeded beyond what she'd imagined possible, her first reaction wasn't pride or happiness. It was concern about how she looked. I told her I loved my brother and wanted nothing but the best for him, that my donation had nothing to do with competition or proving anything. It was about helping students and honoring the value of education in a meaningful way. But her comment today had crossed a line I couldn't ignore anymore. I explained that moving forward, she needed to understand something fundamental. My success, my choices, my life path, they were valid regardless of whether she approved or understood them. I would no longer accept being called an embarrassment or a disappointment. If she wanted to be proud of me, if she wanted to have a relationship where we actually talked about my life and my work, I was open to that. But it would require her to actually listen, to acknowledge that success comes in many forms, to stop using her narrow definition as the only acceptable standard. If she couldn't do that, then we would maintain a polite but distant relationship, and she would need to stop making comments about me in public or in private. She stood there, and for the first time in my memory, she had no quick comeback, no dismissive remark. She just nodded slowly, whether in understanding or merely in acknowledgement I couldn't tell. We parted ways in that parking lot without much more conversation, but something fundamental had shifted between us. She could no longer pretend I was a failure. The dean of a major university, hundreds of witnesses, an official donation record, all of that stood as irrefutable proof that my life had meaning and value. So what's the moral of this story? What's the takeaway beyond the satisfaction of proving someone wrong? I think it's this. The people who are supposed to know you best, the ones who should be your biggest supporters, are sometimes the ones who see you least clearly. They get locked into narratives they've created about who you are, and even when the evidence contradicts those narratives, they refuse to update their perspective. My mother decided early on that because I didn't follow a traditional path, I must be failing. She held on to that belief so tightly that she missed years of actual success happening right in front of her. She was so invested in her definition of achievement that she couldn't recognize achievement when it wore a different face. For anyone watching this who's been in a similar situation, who's been dismissed or underestimated by family members because your success doesn't look the way they expected, I want you to hear this. Your worth isn't determined by someone else's narrow standards. Your accomplishments are real, whether or not they're acknowledged. You don't owe anyone a performance of success that fits their script, but you also don't have to accept being diminished or humiliated. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is set a clear boundary and let reality speak for itself. My mother called me an embarrassment on my brother's graduation day, in family, with the deliberate intention of making me feel small and ashamed. What she didn't know was that within hours, the institution she so deeply respected would be publicly thanking me for a $2.1 million gift that would change the lives of countless students. When those two realities collided, when the dean called my name and that auditorium erupted in applause, something became undeniably clear. I wasn't the family embarrassment. I was the quiet backbone, the hidden benefactor, the one building a legacy while she was busy trying to tear me down. And that truth, once revealed, couldn't be taken back or explained away. It just was. Sometimes that's all the revenge you need, not humiliation or cruelty returned in kind, but simply the truth, standing in the light where everyone can see it.